We now have a joint lecture coming up featuring Professor Dr. Naresh Singh along with Professor Haseeb Mohammed. Professor Dr. Naresh Singh is a professor and executive dean of the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy and director of Center for Complexity Economics, Applied Spirituality and Public Policy. He has a transdisciplinary PhD in environmental sciences from the University of West Indies, with more than 3 decades of public policy experience in senior positions in the United Nations and the federal government of Canada. His latest edited book, published in December 2023, is titled Applied Spirituality and Sustainable Development Policy. Professor Haseeb Mohammed is an associate professor at the Jindal School of International Affairs. He began his professional career in the Trinidad and Tobago Foreign Services in 2009. He worked in the Protocol and Counselor Division for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting and the Summit of the Americas Conference held in Port of Spain. Subsequently, he was posted to the Trinidad and Tobago High Commission in New Delhi, where he served as Secondary Secretary, First Secretary, and High Commissioner. I would now like to request Professor Dr. Naresh Singh to take the stage and begin with the lecture.
So, as you already know, I was born in Guyana. So I'm one of you. I'm a member of the Diaspora. So what I'll do, I will tell you, since they only give me 20 minutes to talk to you, and as an academic, I'm accustomed to talking for an hour and a half. So now I will have to truncate. But let me say to you that many of you, I have a common history. And I've been to all of the countries except Myanmar and New Zealand, from which you are. So I've had a chance to interact, in fact, to work in these countries. So that's the first thing I should probably say. I've worked in about 80 countries around the world because I have served the United Nations Development Program in New York. I served the Caribbean Environmental Health Institute, which we built in St. Lucia. And that means already you have nearly 15 countries which are members of the Caribbean community. And then when I served the federal government of Canada, and I have to admit right away that I'm also Canadian. When I served the federal government of Canada, it was with the Canadian International Development Agency, and through that agency I traveled quite a bit as well and served many countries. Of course, at that time when I served in Canada, I couldn't go to the small countries because, you know, in this diplomacy thing, I was a director general in the policy branch. And if a DG of the government of Canada goes to a country, it signifies that Canada has some form of interest, either culturally, economically, politically, or something, as all our diplomats here know. But I did have a chance to visit all the smaller countries in many different capacities. All right, so now just like many of you, my great-grandfather left India in 1890 and went to Guyana and settled there. So that's how we started our little dynasty in Guyana. So I am 4th generation Indian. And I am among the very few fortunate ones. Well, the first thing I should say to you is that I was a Commonwealth scholar, and I had a chance to go either to Canada or to India, and I wanted to study tropical agriculture. That was my interest for my master's. Fortunately, I met a research scientist from India in Guyana, had a chance to talk to him, and he said, well, you should go to the #1 tropical agricultural research institute in the world, which is in India, and that's the Indian Agricultural Research Institute. When I heard that, my decision was made. Guelph is the top agricultural university in Canada, while IARI is the top for tropical agriculture, not only in India, but in, I would imagine, most of the world. So that's how I got a chance to come to India, long before anyone else from my family came back. So I was the first to return. And my father had kept some names of his grandfather, which was my great-grandfather, the names of 3 brothers, my great-grandfather and his 2 brothers, and the name of a village. I was able to use that, and a friend of mine who was in my class at IARI, and I went to that village and found my roots. I don't have the time to give you the story. If we have time, I'll tell you the fantastic story, because they didn't know that my great-grandfather had even left. He suddenly disappeared. He ran away with these British people who were collecting people to go work on the sugar plantations. And if he had told his family he was going, he would not have been allowed to go. So he didn't tell them anything. He just went with it. And they, when they told me what they thought had happened to him, they figured he had gone to the Himalayas and become a yogi. So apparently he had this kind of, if you like, inclination. So when I reflect on that, from what I will share with you, sometimes I think maybe it's in my genes for the kind of work I do now. So anyway, that's a bit of the diasporic journey. So having come back to India as a Commonwealth scholar and spent 2 years, I have to tell you, when I arrived, I was shocked. I was Guyanese to the core. And I had no idea, excepting some bad information I have gotten from people about India. And so I was really worried when I came. And so when I came first, I could not relate to the culture. I had a kind of a culture shock. And it took me about 1 semester, and I kept questioning myself, what is it that has happened? How is it that I am so different from what I'm observing and engaging with? People are so different, apart from the language, which was an issue. Fortunately, at Pusa Institute is a postgraduate educational institute. Everything is done in English. So that was not a problem. But after 1 semester, I decided not to look at India with my brain, but to look at India with my heart. And when I did that, everything changed. And that has still influenced what I do, and now which I will talk to you about. So, that's my diasporic introduction. I'm sure you can't beat that. So, both of us who will talk to you in this session, both of us are from the Caribbean. I am from Guyana, and Haseeb is from Trinidad and Tobago. There are probably not many of the diaspora here at Jindal. I don't think, maybe the 2 of us, maybe 1 or 2 more, I'm not sure. So let me tell you a little bit what do I want to share with you about India, apart from that little intro. The first thing is that I work in public policy. Having been a public policy practitioner for a very long time, and I work a lot on sustainable development challenges. So I have a little claim to fame, maybe, in that I led the teams that introduced the ideas of sustainable livelihoods. So the concept of sustainable livelihoods, there was 1 paper in the literature in 1992. I started to work on this subject in 1993 in a small way. I had a small team at the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Canada. And we started thinking about how to reduce poverty in the world while conserving the natural resource base at the same time. There was this notion in the literature that poor people damage their environment in order to make a living. When we did our studies, we found that that was a false notion. The data did not support that. When poor people damaged the environment, it was because some wealthy person was behind the scenes and utilizing them for their own private purposes to generate wealth for some kind of a middleman or something. So we did work on public policy to look at how a country's public policies were impacting on the livelihoods of people at the local level. So we studied the macro-micro linkages. And then we attempted to find win-win situations where the public policy were supportive of the great adaptive strategies that people used, and found that there were hardly any. In most countries, their public policies don't reinforce local adaptive strategies. they are driven, at least at that time, they were driven by GDP per capita concerns. And when you drive GDP per capita concerns to get increases in average GDP per capita, your focus inevitably falls on those who can produce more, the wealthier, more productive sectors, and people who have voice in politics. So we did that bit of work, and then the UNDP invited me to introduce that to their work, which we did, and then that led to about 40 different countries, and most of the United Nations institutions, the ILO, the FAO, and so on, in adapting and introducing this approach. Now I'm telling you this because it's going to relate to what I'm doing now. What was the big revolution in this sustainable livelihoods work? It was a very simple thing. I never thought it would become a kind of a revolution in development circles. When we work with poor communities, we start with what they have, not with what they need. That was the revolution. So we start with their assets, not their needs. When you start with assets, you are really tapping into the energy of the local people. You are tapping into their self-esteem and their respect, rather than when you do a needs analysis, you are saying what the anthropologist will call the hidden script. The hidden script is that you do not have, I have, and I will give to you. When you do that, you are likely to create dependency. And that's the kind, you can't set the stage for self-empowerment. In fact, I wrote a book on empowerment and then discovered that empowerment was really a nonsense word. Empowerment doesn't work in international development cooperation because those who have power never give power to those who do not have, never willingly. And that is why for a very long time we had violent revolutions to change power relations until we had non-violent revolutions like Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela and so on. So with that little background, I've continued my work on public policy relating to poverty and sustainable development. When I was struggling with this, sustainable development was a new concept back in the day. I was looking for a theory of sustainable development. And the only theory being used at that time was economics. It was all based on economics. Clearly, economics is important, but it's 1/3 of the construct of sustainable development, which also must have social equity and ecological integrity. So where was a theory that brought all these three together? And that I could not find. There was no such theory of sustainable development at that time. And in my search, I found something called complexity theory. And that was being pioneered in those days based on chaos theory and so on. And complexity theory, I found, had such powerful explanatory potential that I started to work with complexity theory. And that is why here at Jindal, we teach complexity economics. It's very different from the assumptions made by neoclassical economics. Some of you would have studied economics. And remember what they taught you? They taught you that humans were fully rational. I hope you don't agree with that. They also taught you that we had full information sets in order to make decisions. They taught you that we were all completely selfish and all we did was to maximize utility, right? And then they taught you that the economy was always in equilibrium or it will tend to equilibrium. And then you could make equations. All those 4 assumptions have nothing to do with reality, or do they? Well, you guys can judge for yourself. And that is why our students here study neoclassical economics, because it's still the dominant paradigm, and so they need to know that. But they also study behavioral economics and complexity economics, which are now at the leading edge of this field. But then, let me tell you now and then come to the part of why, or what I think is the engagement of the diaspora with India, and why I think this is so important. And why is it that I'm here anyway? So I'm a Guyanese citizen and a Canadian citizen, and here I am teaching in India. Why would this be? So most people get a bit confused. Why would he be here of all places? So this one is great, right? The university is wonderful, as I'm sure you will find out. I can't say the same for Sonipat, where we live. You know, it's a little bit different. But in any event, you know, at 48 degrees Celsius and that kind of thing, if you get a power cut and the AC is not running, you can imagine what happens, right? And we just went through that. So what do I do now? You would hear from my little introductory remarks that I teach also and do research on something called applied spirituality and public policy. And I think that would be of some interest to you. You would have seen some of our students say that what they think makes India great is the spirituality. Anywhere in the world, and as I mentioned, I've been in 80 countries around the world. The world looks to India as the land of spirituality, more than any other single country. Yes, it is a land of many other things. But 3,000 years ago, this country gave rise to a range of spiritual traditions, also called religions, but I distinguish between religion and spirituality. I make a very clear distinction, and I'll tell you the importance of that. But I do work on spirituality because I really want to tap into wisdom. Where is the wisdom in the world? So as a public policy specialist, we teach our students about evidence-based policy. So if you're in policy world, you know that policy should be based, at least in part, on evidence. Some kind of scientific evidence. Could be social science or natural science, but scientific evidence, right? And what is that evidence that we base our policies on? Data. We must have data. Oh, we have lots of data. Now we call it big data. So much. Some of that data is converted into information. So we have some information. Some of that information becomes knowledge. And that's a commonly understood little spectrum, from data to information to knowledge. And then there is one more step. From knowledge to wisdom. So that's the final step. When you look at our policies, it has lots of data, or sometimes not, too much politics and not enough data, and then some information and even less knowledge, and about zero wisdom. When you look at the world, you must be concerned about this. Look at climate change. I was at the Second World Climate Conference in 1990 when the world took the decision that the climate was going to change and create havoc in the world. And so I was part of the negotiating teams that negotiated the Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. And then we came to 2015 to Paris, and we took some decisions, voluntary targets. And we are nowhere near taking enough action to manage climate change. We said we'd keep the temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius, rise above pre-industrial levels. Last year, we crossed 1.5, right? 2023. Every succeeding year is apparently becoming the hottest year. And climate change is only one. We have a bunch of things going on that a new word has been coined called polycrisis. Now, polycrisis is now a commonly accepted word. In fact, I've just written a paper for a diplomatic academy in UAE looking at polycrisis through the lens of complexity, how to understand it, and how should diplomats approach their jobs differently, based on that interaction we had with the UAE diplomats here. So the challenge is, what is wrong? How is it that humanity can take decisions like the 17 Sustainable Development Goals? How can we make decisions on climate change? How can we make decisions on, if you like, species extinction, and then don't act? How are we so stuck in short-term political cycles so that our public policy and decision making is stuck in 4 or 5 year targets? Surely we should have another way of managing our affairs. This country has a long history of a civilization that was quite sustainable at one time. I can't say the same right now. I hope it will evolve in another way soon. But it can make that change. So I have been on the search for what is wrong with humanity and public policy and the way we do it. What is wrong fundamentally with the way corporations run their business? And here are a few of the answers on the work that we are doing. So we are doing work on exploring the wisdom traditions and how they might be brought into public policy. That's a very challenging piece of work because most people think of spirituality as a private, individual thing. You go in a corner and you pray or you meditate. It has nothing to do with public policy. We believe that must change. You know why it must change? Because we don't call ourselves human doings, right? And we don't call ourselves human havings. We call ourselves human beings. But we don't study being. We don't know the politics of being. We only know the politics of having, which is called political economy. And that's what we are exploring. Now, this is a tough job. So fortunately, and if you come back to my class, I will go through in detail what we do. But for today, now there's a lot of literature on spiritual intelligence. I am just working with my small team now to make a survey instrument by which we can measure the level of spirituality in a community. Not religion. See, religion has doctrine and beliefs, and it tells you what you must do and not do. That's not what we are in. We are talking about spirituality as the human experience of their own true nature. Nothing to do with religion. You can draw from religion if you wish. You see, if you worked with religion, you could not influence public policy because of the separation of church and state, to use those words, right? Because you have to be secular, and the spirituality we study is secular spirituality. Now, why is it that this is important for you as a diaspora, and why is it important for India? So in this work, and it's progressing quite well now, we even have field work. We are using philosophical insights from Sufism and looking at the public policy implications for Kashmir. As you know, Kashmir is one of our states in which we have the majority of the population is Muslim, and they might relate much easier to Sufism, which is the spiritual dimension of Islam. And we are looking at work in Maharashtra on the ground on water management, so spirituality and water policy. And we are looking at Madhya Pradesh in 512 villages on their own material wealth, or how they get out of poverty, and what are their levels of spirituality. All of this is now ongoing, and that work is happening. But we are now developing a program where we plan to bring top CEOs of the world's largest corporations. And we are beginning to make the networks, and we hope that they will come. And those who are progressive leaders. See, the former head of Unilever, which is a huge corporation, has started a thing called the Oxford Experience. They bring together a bunch of top CEOs and they look at what their contributions can do to make the problem of climate change less. And we are looking at what we can do to bring the world's top CEOs, but bring wisdom into the decision making of the corporation. And some of them are saying yes already. They are ready to take the baton and lead that change, and then influence their own colleagues to come here and for us to talk about bringing wisdom into corporate decision making. Finally, let me wrap up by making the big point I promised you I'll make, and that is, looking at the world, we cannot have global change, global impact, unless we have a country take the lead. Because like me, I have, you know how the United Nations works, and individuals do not have much influence in the UN. It's countries that go to the JII, right? The General Assembly. It's countries that sit on the second committee, and so on and so on. It's countries that run governments. They should be the people, but so far it's still governments, not we the people yet. The G20. So if you look at the big geopolitical blocks, we have to have a country that will make this lead, take this change. When I look around the world, there was a time when I thought that Europe would be the conscience of the world. I've given up on that hope. Some countries that are superpowers now, there is no way they can be the leader for obvious reasons. The US is clearly not capable of this kind of leadership, nor China. And if it's not the US or China, and it's not Europe, the Scandinavian countries, I don't think, have the credibility. They have done a good or better capitalism than many others, and we have a lot to learn from them. But you go by elimination, and the only country that I believe is capable of leading a revolution in public policy which uses wisdom as part of that decision-making process is India. Now, we can discuss this at length. I have gone through and thought it through, and I believe if you look at India's recent G20 presidency and how it came out of that looking really good, and its geopolitical credibility, if you look at the land of wisdom, here is where they claim that the wisdom all started and grew. For so many reasons, and we can list them, India has to take this lead. But nobody knows how to do it because the researchers have not looked at this. We all accept the kind of science we were trained in, the kind of economics we were trained in, and we believe somehow the world will become a better place. I don't believe that anymore after 30 years of working at the most senior policy levels of the world. And that is why I am here, and that is why I think that this kind of research is critical. Our pool of people is growing. Other countries are coming on board. And the diaspora, to close on this, you need to become engaged in this endeavor. It's a kind of a wild endeavor in a way. Who would have thought that this might be something, a thing, as my daughter will say? Is that even a thing? But this has to become a thing if you are going to have the kind of world you want to live in. And I believe you will have a credibility being part of the Indian diaspora when this country takes the lead, the geopolitical lead. We will need to call on this 33 million diaspora so that as you start to talk and think about this with our support or on your own, that your countries might become engaged and we can have this tidal wave that really makes this world a better place. Otherwise, I'm afraid the prospects do not look really bright. I hope humanity will come to its senses before long, and it will need a little push. I think that push is going to come from India and from its diaspora. Thank you.
Distinguished professors, representatives from the Ministry of External Affairs, participants of the Know India program, good morning. My name is Haseeb Mohammed, born and brought up in Trinidad and Tobago. Currently, I teach at the Jindal School of International Affairs. I teach more law and human rights programs. I teach diplomatic law, international law, religion and human rights, and international protection of human rights. When I was asked to contribute to a topic about diaspora and the Indian imagination, India and its the imagination within the diaspora, I went back to literature, English literature, because my first degree was in English literature. I studied English literature as a promise to someone who taught me at secondary school. And in the last few months, two people who taught me at the University of the West Indies, Professor Gordon Rowley and Dr. Fonzu Ajima, they passed away. So you're getting old when the people who taught you of school has begun their ascension to another life, right? And so when I was asked to speak about the Indian diaspora, I went back to literature, and I remember Professor Gordon Rowley. He taught me post-colonial literature, and this idea of the diaspora and Derek Walcott came to mind, right? So for those of you who don't know, Derek Walcott, he's a Nobel laureate from the Caribbean island of St. Lucia, and also Dr. Chaulia mentioned a more polemical, controversial figure, V.S. Naipaul, who is also a Nobel laureate in literature, but of Indian origin or Indian descent. Right? So I'll speak a little bit about India in the eyes of the Indian diaspora through Derek Walcott, right? Because in 1992, Derek Walcott, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, right? And for those of you who study literature, you should read his speech, right? Because this is a man who's born in the Caribbean. He's of mixed ancestry, right? And at the pinnacle, or at the crowning moment of his life, he's speaking about India, right? And he's not speaking about India because he's been to India. He's speaking about India because he's experienced India in Trinidad, right? Because he spent a large part of his life in Trinidad and Tobago. He was actively involved in theater. He was actively involved in carnival and the culture of Trinidad, right? So this is an individual who, at one of the most important time in his life, he speaks about India in his Nobel laureate speech, right? And I'll just read, I won't bore you all, I'll just read little vignettes of his speech just so that you could understand, right? You could understand India, its imagination, right? Not just from its diaspora, but for someone of Caribbean, African origin, right? And his Nobel laureate speech was entitled "The Antilles, Fragments of Epic Memory," right? So just to give you some background, Derek Walcott, when he spoke about Caribbean identity, he was more embracing than, say, someone like V.S. Naipaul, who people would consider nihilistic, cynical, right? Derek Walcott was more, he embraced his European heritage, his African heritage, his Indian heritage, right? And this is what he says in his Nobel laureate speech, right? And he begins by describing this. Those of you from Trinidad would know felicity, right? So felicity is a place in Trinidad. But in the English language, felicity means intense happiness, right? So understand what he's saying here. So he begins by saying felicity, a village in Trinidad and Tobago on the edge of the Caroni Plain, the wide central plain that still grows sugar and to which indentured cane cutters were brought after emancipation So the small population of Felicity is East Indian, right? So he's beginning by describing an Indian village in Trinidad and Tobago. And on the afternoon that I visited with friends from America, all the faces along its road were Indian, which, as I hope to show, was a moving, beautiful thing, right? That's the intense happiness he feels by being in this Indian village in Trinidad. Because this Saturday afternoon, Ram Leela, the epic dramatization of the Hindu epic, the Ramayana, was going to be performed, and the costumed actors from the village were assembling on a field strung with different colored flags like a new gas station, and beautiful Indian boys in red and black were aiming arrows haphazardly into the afternoon light. Low blue mountains on the horizon, bright grass, clouds that would gather color before the light went. Felicity, right? What a gentle Anglo-Saxon name for an epical memory, right? So he's saying, right? He's saying in his speech that, you know, this experience, right? This experience, or what he's seeing in front of him, because he goes on to describe, you know, the Ramayana play that he sees, right? So for those of you in Trinidad and Tobago, prior to the lead up of the Diwali celebrations, in certain areas of Trinidad and Tobago, they reenact the Ramayana in Felicity in Trinidad, in Cedar Hill, right? You still have that reenactment, right? Because it's a large part of the Indian identity in Trinidad and Tobago, right? And the pageantry, the costume, it's been going on for probably more than 100 years, right? So it's a big event, not just for the Indian origin community in Trinidad and Tobago, but it's national, right? It's national in its appeal, right? So it transcends ethnicity, religion, right? So it's part of the Trinidadian identity. It's not just Hindu or Indian, right? It's part of it's a national identity of the national population of Trinidad and Tobago, right? So Dr. Chaulia would have mentioned the Ramayana in Bali, right? Similarly, in Trinidad and Tobago, there's its own interpretation, right? And he goes on to say deities were entering the field, what we generally call Indian music, right? So in the Caribbean, we have to be careful with woke society today. But in the Caribbean, you know, if you call someone an Indian or a black man, it's nothing derogatory, right? There's no harm in it, right? But now with social media and all these things, you have to be careful how you use language. But here he uses it in a Trinidadian or Caribbean way. Deities were entering the field. What we generally call Indian music was blaring from the open platform shed from which the epic would be narrated. Costumed actors were arriving, princes and gods, I suppose. What an unfortunate confession. Gods, I suppose, is the shrug that embodies our African and Asian diaspora, right? So basically what Derek Walker doing here is that he's celebrating, right? He's celebrating the identity of the Caribbean within his Nobel laureate speech, in the sense that he is saying, right, we embody Africa, we embody Europe, we embody India. I had often thought but never seen Ram Leela, right? So what he's saying is, prior to this time, he had never seen this pageantry, this type of play or expression. and had never seen this theater, an open field, right? So in Trinidad and Tobago, it's all done in an open field, or in India, what you call a Maidan, right? Because it's easier. Remember, Caribbean, small community, there's no infrastructure like theater and all the things we enjoy now. And had never seen this theater, an open field with village children as warriors, princes, and gods, right? So a lot of your socialization in the Caribbean, Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, you socialize, right? Through your temple, through your mandir, through your mosque, right? And your sense of identity, who you are, and your perception of Indian-ness is derived from these institutions. I had no idea what the epic was, who its hero was, what enemies he fought, yet I had recently adapted the Odyssey for a theater in England. Right? So for those of us who would have studied classical studies, you would have read the Iliad, the Odyssey, right? Derek Walcott was heavily influenced by the Iliad and the Odyssey. Those are Greek. Now, the Indian epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, are epics as well, right? And what he's doing here is he's juxtaposing, right, these epics and the values or the identity that they give to human beings. Presuming that the audience knew the trials of Odysseus, hero of another Asia Minor epic, while nobody in Trinidad knew any more than I did about Ram, Kali, Shiva, Vishnu, apart from the Indians, a phrase I use pervertedly because that is the kind of remark you can still hear in Trinidad apart from the Indians, quote unquote, right? So he's saying that in Trinidad, right, this idea of Indian-ness, right, it's derived, yes, from be it religion, Hinduism, be it mythology, or be it through the expression of the Ramayana, you have this sense of Indian-ness in Trinidad and Tobago, right? And I'll just read one last paragraph just to tie in what he says or how it culminates in his conception of Caribbean identity, of this hybrid or this amalgamation that we have within the Caribbean region, or this coming together of different people or different ethnicities or origins coming to live in one common geographical space, as we know as the Caribbean or the West Indies, right? And this is the profound thought within his Nobel laureate speech. And he says, break a vase, right? So if you throw a vase onto the ground, he says, break a vase, and the love that reassembles the fragments is stronger than that love which took its symmetry for granted when it was a whole, right? So the fragment he's speaking about is Caribbean people, right? Because for those of you who come from the Caribbean, you'll know that your origins are not from there, right? You are descendants of people who would have come to the Caribbean. So break a vase, and the love that reassembles the fragments is stronger than that love which took its symmetry for granted when it was a whole, right? Meaning your sense of identity, your sense of Indian-ness. And he's relating this to the portrayal of the Ram Leela prior to the Diwali celebrations, right? Your sense of identity, cultural identity, Indian-ness. The glue that fits the pieces is the sealing of its original shape. What's that glue, right? The glue is your religion, right? So be it Hinduism, be it Islam, it's your religion, right? You derive a lot of your perception or your worldview coming from Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, the Caribbean. It's heavily influenced by your idea of Indian-ness. So that's the glue he speaks about. The glue that fits the pieces is the sealing of its original shape. It is such a love that resembles our African and Asiatic fragments. Right? So he's saying that this celebration, this Ram Leela, right? It's a celebration of love. It's a celebration of identity, and it's a celebration of us Caribbean people. Right? Sorry to be biased and speaking about the Caribbean, but he's speaking with respect to the Caribbean identity. This gathering of broken pieces, right? Broken pieces means the different identities that make up the Caribbean: African, Asian, Chinese, European. The gathering of broken pieces is the care and the pain of the Antilles. And if the pieces are desperate, ill-fitting, they contain more than pain than their original sculpture. Those icons and sacred vessels taken for granted in their ancestral places. Right? So he's saying that, in the Caribbean, we have this strong embrace to the extent that even if it came or its original place, the love that it has in the Caribbean might outdo that which it came from, right? So the point being made here is that, say for example, be it the cultural practices, be it the Hinduism or the Islam, the religious practices that you see in the Caribbean, it would be that which was practiced 200 or 300 years ago, right? Now, India as a civilization has progressed, but in the Caribbean, some of the practices, because there's this strong attachment or this strong desire, right, to keep your sense of Indianness or Indian identity, in some ways, some of these conservative practices, right? This is what modern India might say, or progressive India. Some of these conservative practices that you have in Trinidad, right? It still exists in Trinidad and Tobago because of that deep love and desire to maintain your Indian identity, right? Because I'll give you one example. The first time I came to India was close to Diwali. So I went to a Diwali party, and people were drinking booze and gambling. And for me, it was a shock, right? Because my grandmother's Indian, Hindu, right? My mother's Hindu. So it was a shock for me to see people gambling and drinking booze, right? Alcohol, right? Because we've been socialized to understand that Diwali is something sacred, right? It's something that doesn't involve alcohol, right? We drink alcohol Christmas, New Year's, but not around Diwali time, right? So for me, it was a shock, right? But then I realized that, my concept or my perception of Hinduism or India is very different from what I'm seeing here, right? So even for me, I have to understand that, my imagined idea or the conservative idea that I have of India, India as a civilization, as a way of life, it has progressed, right? So, that was one experience that really taught me that, some of the ideas or perceptions that we have of Indianness is quite conservative, right? Because for us, we know, like my grandmother being Hindu, every year we'll have a prayer for our grandfather. We refrain from alcohol. If my cousin getting married, she'll do fasting and all these things. In India, you don't have that, right? Well, it depends on which part of India you go. But, for us, I realize how conservative, coming from Trinidad and Tobago, how conservative our idea of Indianness is, right? And I'll stop here, but the reason I wanted to use literature as a medium to engage with you all is that um, even as a diaspora, just like how Walcott, right, spoke to that identity, as a diaspora, we have an identity. It's a growing identity. It'll become stronger, obviously, with the passage of time. And you see, right, you see the ascension of individuals. Most recently in politics, Vivek Ramaswamy, who attempted to be a US presidential candidate. You see, right, his strong Indian identity, right? And, he was even questioned of whether, whether his Hindu values or him being a Hindu would be an impediment to him serving as a president of the United States of America. Now, if we are to understand or to accept that we live in a truly universal world, or we uphold universal values, right? Religion, skin color, place of birth shouldn't be an impediment, right, to our development, right? And you'll see with years to come, with a stronger diaspora or Indian diaspora, you'll see its contribution to international development, or its contribution, the Indian diaspora, its contribution to the world. Because as a diaspora with unique experiences, every diaspora experience is different, so every contribution would be different, right? And India is a sovereign entity, right? So for us from the diaspora, remember, we know there are many faces of India. We know India, imagined romantic India. India is a motherland, right? But India as a sovereign entity, post-1947, you'll see that the contribution of the Indian government in ensuring that that close connection with its diaspora, right? It didn't start today. It started post with the decolonization period, when its leaders made a genuine and real effort, right, to be part of the, to be and contribute to international society in a significant way, right? So you would have seen it, be it at the policy, the level of foreign policy and state visits, right? So what you see happening today, right, with the rise or the emergence of an assertive India, it didn't start today, right? India is a sovereign entity, and their interaction with the diaspora or with the developing world or with the newly independent states of the Commonwealth started since the post-1947 era, all right? And what we're experiencing today is part of that, right? That work started back then. So with these few words, I'd like to conclude by saying I wish you all the best. For those of you, if it's your first time in India, if you're feeling a bit confused, disoriented, lost, or just, just a bit overwhelmed by, especially for those of you who come from a small island of 1 million people, you'll find 1 million people on a street in Old Delhi, right? So, enjoy your time in India, and I hope you all have a fulfilling and rewarding experience. It's a magical place, and it's my home at this point in time, and I feel blessed to be here and to share my life with the people I'm around. Right, so I'd like to wish you all the best, and take care of yourselves and enjoy your Indian experience, the full reality, not the imagined one. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, professors, for your valuable contributions. The floor is now open to questions. Please make it a little quick because we have less time.
Give him this chair. here, maybe. Come here,
Hello. I have a question.
please, go ahead.
Over the second sessions, one of the key aspects I have heard, it is sustainable development. So the question is, what are some of the sustainable practices that are in place for the campus operations?
Okay, where are you from?
I'm from Fiji, and my name is Sanjeshni. I work at Fiji National University as a quality liaison officer attached with Office of Learning and Teaching.
Thank you. Actually, none of us can answer that.
Yeah, no, I can.
You know. You've been.
Professor should be able to answer.
Yeah.
Is JII doing?
So the first thing is, I don't know why people brought this in, but this is what we normally do. This is the first one. Plastic bottles are not allowed on our campus. You wouldn't find any plastic bottle, but you would find people, all students bring their water bottles. We have just produced a second Sustainable Development Report for our university. So we produced one earlier. It goes through the full energy consumption, waste management, everything. So this and what kinds of controls we have in place, what kinds of auditing systems for all our practices. So this is available now on our website. It's called the Sustainable Development Report, Jindal Global University. And there are 2 such reports that will document everything for you. But we look at our energy practices, waste management, individual practices, and so on.
Thank you, sir. Also, apart from that, there's a school on environment and sustainability, and there are a lot of student-led initiatives on campus for sustainability on campus. There are rainwater harvesting systems put in place. They're not very big, but for like a student-led engagement and an initiative, there's that. There are also solar panels on the campus, and especially you'll see when we take you for the campus tour, you'll see there's a lot of greenery on this campus. So that there are different kinds of trees, and students have put up a lot of trees and plants. So that's why there as well. And again, plastic and plastic bottles, as sir mentioned, plastic cups and polythenes, they're not allowed on campus. Even the students are not allowed to use them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And there's also a request.
I just want to Yeah. Just, I'm also connected with the JII as a senior fellow, and I just thought to add one point here that we not only talk about doing part, but we also talk about the being part. Because if you say that you're doing sustainable thing, it can have a limited value. But you are being sustainable. You know that India has created something known as a Mission Life, which talk about removing the irresponsible consumption. So how to increase your inner part, your inner power, so that you do not need to have those kind of wasteful consumption and those kind of a thing. So we have practices here like meditation, mindfulness, enriching your inner self, and that also lead to the sustainable heart and the sustainable as a being. So I thought to add this point, we have these kind of courses here, and so which lead a lot of such thing. Thank you.
Thank you. I must just mention Professor Pankaj Gupta is a great exponent of spirituality and the praxis and the theory and the combination of it. We have a lot of such what can be in the normal settings be called like offbeat or out of the box thinking and unconventional, the wisdom, the word is wisdom. And these gentlemen, they all preach and profess and live that and train our students. So if your communities back home in Fiji want a session on these kind of things, like I promised before, we could do more through online means. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And if I also have a request, while the tour, I would request if you could also take us to the library services, because in Fiji, we have Fiji National University. So I'd like to see the library services for a profound university as Jindal Institute.
Yeah. Sorry, there's some refurbishing and revamping going on right now. So unfortunately, because the semester break, we have a very grand library with a magnificent reading hall with the United Nations flag emblazoned, all the countries of the world are displayed there, including yours. But right now, there's some construction work going on. So unfortunately, we may miss that. Okay, you had a question.
We will be taking them to the Imaginarium, though, where they can get an idea of some things.
Hi, good afternoon. Videsh from Trinidad and Tobago here. As an engineer with some experience with working with public policy in a democratic nation, we find a shift sometimes with the public policy possibly not being so much heavily influenced by wisdom, as you say, but a lot of governance. So the 5-year pendulum we speak about, whatever the previous government does isn't good. So, seeing as this formalized approach of diaspora engagement is a heavily, Moody-led administration type initiative, do you guys think that these initiatives like the iTech program and the New India program, which I very much appreciate, is it under threat or faces any challenges in any way? Or is it that the benefits of such are so ingrained that we don't have to worry? Because sometimes there was with Biden, everyone was like, Donald Trump, good riddance, but now we see him back on the podium again. So it's the political climate is so unpredictable. I'd just like to get your opinions from a public policy expert on where we are on this wisdom path. Thank you.
Well, I asked Professor Chawlia to add his words on this, since he knows the politics of this country better than I do. But generally speaking, the wisdom is nowhere near. We have just started this work. I don't know of, maybe Bhutan, I don't know, but hardly any country that is using it at the moment. They don't know how to incorporate wisdom into public policy. They barely do scientific evidence into public policy. But in any democracy, policy will always be driven by vested interest. Public policy is never free of politics. That's always going to be there. So until the electorate becomes educated and aware enough of their own being and their potential wisdom and power to vote for those politicians that would make policy in a different way, I'm afraid we are stuck in this mess for a while. But let me hear a more optimistic view, maybe from Professor Chawlia.
We've had a lot of remarkable stability in this country. I mean, this is the third term for Mr. Modi. So we don't have flip-flops. It's a continuity. And even before Mr. Modi, there was 10 years of one prime minister and one regime from 2004 to 14. So in a way, India is like it's very stable and very predictable. You don't have like dramatic changes or upheavals or turmoil. And barring some peripheral regions where we have like armed conflicts in Kashmir and in the northeast, most of the country is fairly stable and there's policy continuity. As to wisdom coming in, I think that's a bigger question and it's a deeper one. But our polity is actually, and India is, just yesterday, I'll tell you something interesting. I took my kids to a local restaurant here in a place called Murthal, which is full of these, North Indian eating out places. They're called dhabas. Now, at one of them, there's an ice cream parlor, or a counter, where there are two young men who are doing all these, Turkish ice cream tricks, which you know. And at the end of it, I asked them, and they said they're from Myanmar. Now, we have friends from Myanmar here. And they're actually refugees who are escaping armed conflict. So I'm just giving you one example of how India, because of its stability, because of economic growth, and because of its predictability and relative openness, is a magnet to immigrants and refugees from all over. In a way, it's like America in Asia. It's a lot more open than China or Japan, for example. So there is that tradition here of absorbing a lot of visitors, especially the ones who have come in large groups because of persecution. So India is still the haven and the refuge for people facing large-scale threats. Like, for example, when the Taliban were ruling, when the Taliban were not in power, but there were lots of killings and attacks on religious minorities in neighboring countries, like in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and even in Bangladesh. They would find India as the last resort for their survival and for their safety. So that way, this country, I can't go deeper into the wisdom part of it, but I can say that it's very reliable and dependable and trustworthy because of its predictability and its stability.
Let's get a round of questions because time is short. Yes, sir. And then we will answer all of them. Please identify yourself and go ahead.
Good afternoon. Tony Raj from Trinidad and Tobago. Before I ask my question, I just have to say Professor Haseeb is completely right about the expectations that we have about India and the reality. Because before I came here, my mom told me to eat as much KFC as you can because you won't get any chicken in India. But we were proven wrong. But my question.
What do you mean?
But
there is the best butter chicken in the world.
But my question is for Professor Naresh. You spoke about linking spirituality to public policy. What I wanted to know, what are the issues you have seen with linking spirituality to public policies, and how do you guys curb those issues?
Mm-hmm. Any others? Let's go around and take some. Please.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Isaac from Trinidad and Tobago. I actually don't have a question. I would just like to add some information toward what Mr. Mohammed was speaking earlier. So in Trinidad and Tobago, we celebrate Ramlila celebrations. We actually have the oldest Ramlila ground in the Caribbean, which is 148 years old. Today, this year will mark 140 years of Ramlila. Mm-hmm. And like Mr. Mohammed was saying, many people come from all over the world to witness these celebrations. Many people, for example, UWI students, they come to this celebration to do research, and they take it back for their projects and things like that. So Ramlila in our country, it is an amazing experience, and I believe everybody should experience it one day to come.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hello, my name is Teresa Ramlochan. I'm from Guyana. So my question is, with India having good results to most of its Paris Agreement goals, and with Guyana recently becoming an oil nation, do you think there's room for collaboration or contributions to foster sustainable development between these two countries as they both strive for net zero? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then, okay, we'll take the last one here. Please go on.
Hi, Trisha Ragunanan from Trinidad and Tobago. So you touched on evidence-based policy making and the need for data, right? So one of the challenges we face in Trinidad and Tobago is the lack of updated, accurate data to inform development plans and policies. Do you have any suggestions to improve our system?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big problem, huh? So some quick answers. Of course, you can chip in. So on the challenges of spirituality and public policy, the real big problem is I'm looking to India as a potential leader. But the first problem we face is that, let me put it bluntly, I think India is such a religious country that there's little room for spirituality. That's the first big problem. So I asked many spiritual leaders, and this is not a conjecture on my part, I asked them whether they thought India was so religious that it had no room for spirituality, and all of them answered yes. Because the understanding of one's own spiritual nature is about turning to your own reality. It doesn't have to do with some external God or some principles taught by some preacher somewhere. about how to behave and what to do and what to eat. Nothing of that kind. It's about your experiencing a reality bigger than yourself. And that's a little bit of a problem. So that's one. The second problem is that spirituality is so seen so much as religion, it's also seen as a private matter, not to be brought into the public sphere. But we are arguing that the most important dimension in public policy is the human. And that's the missing dimension in sustainability. In environmental management, I myself am trained in environmental management. We have always talked that very word, environmental management, is a problem. Because it's human management. The environment doesn't need management. We don't manage our own behavior. That's why we have an environmental problem. So everything that humans do is to look outside of them externally, and that's not where the problem is. And so we have failed to do that, and that's what we are bringing back into the equation. So these are some of the issues. How are we going to solve them? You know about your IQ. And then after IQ was there for a long time, then we got EQ, emotional quotient or social capital. And the IQ deals with material capital, rational world, and so on. Now we have, and we are researching on SQ. And there are books now written on spiritual intelligence. So SQ21, 7 steps to spiritual intelligence. One I just read is called Quantum Key. 2023 publication, Quantum Key, and it goes through all again, spiritual intelligence. And it's linking it now to spiritual capital. There are corporations whose HR departments are starting to include spiritual intelligence in their interview process. Because they find that such people who are waking up to their own reality make a different kind of employee than those who are still stuck in the past, so to speak. So that's what's going on, and we are contributing to that work. The second point was on oil and Guyana. Well, India and Guyana have a really strong collaboration right now. President Irfan Ali came here and got this top Pravasi Award. And you know, Prime Minister Modi seems to like to hug people, so he got a big hug as well. I mean, he hugs some people, it creates some problem, as you know, like Putin, but anyway, he's a smart, very smart Prime Minister. He must be the only Prime Minister in the world who is able to have this great relationship between Russia and the US, right? So there is an important relationship between India and Guyana on collaboration on oil, and my friends tell me that's because India is planning to buy a lot of oil from Guyana, which is currently maybe the 6th largest producer in the world. But the issue of sustainability, and that's a big one, and we'll see how that works out. But recently there was a hard talk program of BBC. The BBC interviewer interviewed the president of Guyana, and if you haven't seen that clip, you have? Have you seen it? You have. Everybody is circulating this clip.
Attack the Western neocolonialism.
Right, and he said, let me stop you right there. You remember that piece? And but he outlines the evidence. He only missed out 2 pieces, which I as a scholar will put on the table. He did a fantastic job of showing what our forests are doing. We are already net zero, while the UK is looking for net zero at somewhere like 2050. Now, India has to ramp up its ambition. India says net zero by 2070. That's not good enough. Yes, we have 400 million very poor people in this country who need more material comfort, but we need not do that in an environmentally polluting way. So that ambition needs to be ramped up. I hope the collaboration between Guyana and India will be productive and we will learn from each other. Then there is this question about data. Data is a huge problem for most governments, especially developing country governments. So you have 2 problems. The first one is good quality data. And that good quality data has to come from better research, both officially from the Ministry of Statistics, but also from the researchers themselves. And most public policy is made on that data generated by governments. It's problematic because some governments even keep two books, like shopkeepers. You know, shopkeepers keep two books. One is to pay tax, and one is the real thing. And the data by many governments are also like that. When they go to the international community to ask for aid, well, now aid is not that big, but when they go for either concessional finance or they ask for aid, suddenly their poverty levels are very high. And then when they have to go to the elections, then they have reduced poverty dramatically somehow. So having served in the United Nations Development Program, I'm very sensitive to the problems of data. Even where we have good data, getting that good data into the public policy process is a problem, because the public policy is driven by politics and by vested interest. And that's why we will not be able to move forward until the corporations also become involved. And they should be putting money into generating data as well. Finally, I should just say a word on Derek Walcott. I couldn't leave that out. I lived in St. Lucia for 7 years. I happen to know Derek Walcott because we sat down in bars and had a few drinks. He, and he wrote one line that I leave with you that I don't forget, because I read Omeros sitting and looking at the sun setting on the Caribbean Sea, so I could try to live what he was writing. And you know the word Omeros, you see how close it is to Homer, right? So Derek Walcott said, I am Portuguese, I'm Indian, I'm African, because he was a mixed guy. Either I am a United Nations or I am nothing. So I remember that well, and I should also say I lived in St. Lucia, a country of now maybe 150,000 people. 150,000 people, 2 Nobel Prize winners. One in literature and Sir Arthur Lewis in economics. So great interacting with all of you. I hope you have a great lunch. I understand that many of you will enjoy this lunch because you love vegetarian food, right?
Haseeb, anything you'd like to add?
Haseeb.
I think Dr. Naresh, all the questions were more in his direction, but all I could say to you all is that in closing, India is a fascinating place. It's a place not just of your origin, your identity, but you'll see in the future, it'll have a big impact on your lives. And as young people, if you afforded the opportunity, come and live in India. Live in India for 2 months, 3 months. If you want to study, come and study in India, and you'll see your idea of life, your worldview in itself will change. And it's not just because you're Indian or Indian origin, but the diversity and the plurality that you experience in India, it's unlike anywhere else in the world, right? And when the Western world today is, fighting about immigration and migration and woke and what you can see and all these things and all these identity politics, the beauty about India is that every answer that you want to find in life, you'll find it in India, right? So be it ancient India, be it current issues in the world today, you'll find all your answers in India. So India in itself, right, it's a fascinating place geographically. It's an eternal place in the minds and hearts of many of us. And it's great to see, young people being afforded the opportunity to come to this country and experience it in the way that you are. So enjoy your experience, and I wish you all the very best.